Thanks for tuning in. I'm Kevin Triskett, Chief Strategy Officer at CAN-TV, sitting in for Andy Zopp, and this is Chicago Newsroom 2.0. In this special edition of the program, we'll take a closer look at the challenges on the horizon for public education in Chicago as a new presidential administration takes over. We'll also check on the ever-evolving turmoil currently playing out at CPS as a defiant and terminated CEO takes his case to the courtroom, and a defiant mayor, whose approval ratings cratered at the end of 2024, insists he is not in cahoots with his former employer, the very powerful Chicago Teachers Union. We'll get started on the other side of a short break. Stay with us.
Hi, I'm Robin Robinson, inviting you to tune in to the new CAN-TV original program, In Other News. Each week, I will break down newsworthy topics that traditional outlets may ignore, grounded in truth, fun, and blackness, from the trap house to the White House, with the big house in between. Join the conversation on CAN-TV Cable Channel 19, or stream live on cantv.org or on the CAN-TV Plus app. Hyper-local news and critical analysis. Experience the power of community television.
The incoming presidential administration has outlined several policy initiatives that could significantly impact public education in the United States. Some of those key challenges and threats include abolishing the Department of Education, phasing out Title I funding, which provides financial assistance to schools with high percentages of children from low-income families, converting the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act into block grants, expanding school choice initiatives, including the use of vouchers that allow public education funds to be used for private and religious schools, as well as the implementation of curriculum restrictions that target lessons on gender identity, structural racism, diversity initiatives, and the rolling back of protections for LGBTQ+ students. And that's just some of the promises made. Here to discuss how these draconian changes could impact educators and parents and what can be done to push back against them, I'm joined by the President and CEO of the Chicago Public Education Fund, Heather Anichini, and the Chief of Policy with Kids First Chicago, Hal Woods. Heather and Hal, welcome back to the newsroom. Before we dive into the broader topic of public education in the hands of the incoming presidential administration, I'd like to start at the local level. Heather, what are your thoughts on the CPS board's unanimous vote to terminate CPS CEO Pedro Martinez's employment?
Yeah, I mean, CPS needs the community and the broader city to trust and support the decisions that they're making, and it's hard to see, given the reaction, how that move is going to build the trust that they might need moving forward.
And Hal, how is your perspective on how this might affect students in their classrooms?
So at Kids First Chicago, we work with parents and families across the city of Chicago, primarily on the south and the west sides of the city. I think in terms of the day-to-day, we know that Pedro will be at CPS through the end of the year, through June at least. I know that's still kind of going through legal complications right now. I could see day-to-day there could be an exodus of staff potentially at the central office level at CPS if Pedro leaves before the end of this year, or at the end of June. I think longer term, though, one of our primary concerns is the financial stability of CPS. Pedro has worked very hard, particularly in this past year's budget, to ensure that CPS is fiscally solvent. CPS right now faces about a $500 million deficit going into next school year. That doesn't include the cost of a new teacher's contract. That does not include the cost of the pension payment that Mayor Johnson is asking CPS to pay. So we're looking at about $800 million deficit, with Springfield saying that there's no help coming from Springfield. And so as a CPS parent, but also working in the education sector, I think we're very concerned about what next school year looks like for Chicago families.
Yeah, I'm a CPS parent too, and the most frequent topic of conversation in my email seems to be the CTU and CPS negotiations on a new collective bargaining agreement. What are some of the likely ripple effects or potential implications for the contract negotiations with the departure of Pedro Martinez?
Yeah, I mean, we know schools will continue to open. Kids are in school today. Your kids are in school today. Principals, we work mostly with principals at the fund, are running schools, and teachers are teaching. And the contract has been under negotiation for some period of time. It's not clear how some of the financial issues that Hal just mentioned will get resolved in the context of that contract, and some of the critical non-financial issues. For us, issues like whether or not principals and local school councils get to make key decisions, issues like the time students, especially in elementary school, spend learning in classrooms, those issues need to be resolved in order for that contract to be completed.
So we outlined at the beginning of the show some of the potential policies of the new incoming presidential administration. What do you think, Hal, parents in Chicago should be most concerned about as the administration begins just in a few short weeks?
You outlined a couple of the major issues. I mean, certainly with the potential to eliminate the Department of Education and to reduce federal funding for education could have a significant impact. About 10% of CPS's budget does come from federal funds. That includes Title I funds that support low-income students, special education funds, funds to support English language learners, as well as funds to actually support career technical education programming as well. Any of those risks, any of those funds being reduced would put CPS students certainly at risk. We also see, and particularly in parents in our network, we're seeing concerns around actually some of the enforced the immigration deportations. So we're hearing that from our families. We are working right now in our organization to get smart on the facts, to work on trainings for our parents as well to know their rights and also be able to provide them with support to other organizations potentially as well. That could have a significant impact on just student academic achievement, but also social emotional learning. Being afraid to come to school could lead to additional absenteeism for students, so that's a big concern. Some of the other concerns, of course, are some of the cultural curriculum aspects that we've heard. President-elect Trump discuss how he wants to sort of remove woke ideology from schools. What that could mean, like a school district for Chicago, in terms of there's been a ton of work that CPS has done around the 1619 project at the high school level in terms of curriculum. And of course, there's a reduction in Title IX protections for students as well as LGBTQ plus students is also a concern.
Yeah, Heather, especially on the school choice front and a potential push to use public funding for religious or private schools, what's the Chicago Public Education Fund doing to counteract or combat those potential risks or challenges?
Yeah, I mean, we remain focused on helping support principals make good decisions in schools. And we're fortunate in Chicago that there is real local control around curriculum and some of the kinds of decisions that we want to see made in schools, making sure that principals are really well informed about their rights and their ability to make those decisions, and that local school councils feel empowered is an area that we'll continue to double down on.
So 2025 is a year that potentially brings a lot of challenges to Chicago public education. Just wondering what your outlook is. How are you remaining positive, and what are you really focusing on over the course of this year to focus our energy more on students and their learning and not what's happening in the politics around the city?
I think it's really important for us to make sure that we're telling those stories as much as possible. Principals are in school every day. The headlines might not make that clear. Teachers are teaching every day. The conversation about the CTU contract might not make that clear. Kids generally do feel safe in their classrooms and in their schools, and we have to keep investing in the ways that that happens, both at the policy level, making sure that as much as possible we put protections in place for kids, schools, and communities, but also at the very local level so that kids are getting that positive reinforcement on a day in, day out basis.
I think one of the huge seismic shifts that is happening within CPS is this transition to at least now a partially elected school board. We have on January 15th, we're going to see 10 newly elected members as well as 11 appointees of Mayor Johnson beginning kind of a new foray into governance in Chicago Public Schools. I think, again, Chicago Public Schools is the 4th largest school district in the country. 1 out of 5 Chicagoans are either enrolled in or employed by CPS, so it has a huge impact on our civic community as well. And I think parents in our network are hopeful that with this change in governance that we will see a school system that is more responsive, that is more community driven, that is more accountable, and will involve parents, families, educators in the decision-making process more so than prior boards did.
Excellent. And this is a conversation we plan to continue throughout the course of 2025 and beyond. We hope to have you both back. Heather and Hal, thank you so much for making the time to join us to discuss these critically important issues. On the other side of a short break, we'll continue the conversation with this week's Roundtable, featuring UIC's Stephen McClain, Prairie Hills School District 144's Taquia Hylton, and Center on Halsted CEO Joli Robinson. Stay with us.
Hi, I'm financial expert Tamara Durbin, inviting you to join me each week for In the Money, the show that makes money management approachable and enjoyable. Join the conversation at 7 p.m. exclusively on CAN TV Cable Channel 19 or stream live on cantv.org or on the CAN TV Plus app. Elevated conversation and storytelling. Experience the power of community television.
CAN TV is the lens through which Chicago's stories are told, harnessing the unifying power of community television. With CAN TV On Demand, immerse yourself in the richness of our city through exclusive stories and programs tailored just for you, connecting you to the heartbeats of our streets, the voices of our people, and the spirit that makes Chicago unique. Discover the strength of your community on CAN TV On Demand.
To continue our conversation about the current and future state of education under the incoming presidential administration, I'm joined at the round table by an incredible group of leaders, including Stephen McClain, UIC Urban School Leadership Program, Taquia Hylton, Director of School Improvement for Prairie Hills School District 144, and Joli Robinson, CEO of Center on Halsted. Leaders, welcome to the newsroom. Let's dive right in. I'm fascinated by this proposal to eliminate the Department of Education, and I'm wondering how you think a proposal to reduce or eliminate the Department of Education might have on access to high-quality educational opportunities, particularly for low-income and marginalized students.
I think it will have devastating impact, specifically thinking about students and communities that are underserved and marginalized. What we know is that the Department of Education is responsible for three key areas. One is enforcing civil rights, two is equitable funding, and three is accountability. And so when we think about students and communities that are underserved, we know that there's a great risk that those resources won't touch them. And so I'm thinking about Title I funding. I'm thinking about student federal aid. I'm thinking about students with disabilities. And so the Department of Education helps ensure that those communities, those students get what they need to be successful.
And not only that, I think thinking about our early learners for our pre-K programs, that ends up being eliminated, and those are the students that really need the support. Many times our parents need that support and services for them because they may not have babysitting services. And so school is not a babysitting service per se, but it's a way for children as young as 2, 3, 4 years old to be able to get into a school setting and learn those early skills, their letters, their numbers, their colors that they may not get. And so they are pushed further behind when they come into kindergarten or first grade when they don't have those skills.
The only thing I would add is we know historically what it's been like to live in a society that doesn't have a Department of Education, looking out for the welfare of, to be very direct and honest, Black and brown youth, specifically our Black children and students. And so we don't want to reverse that time to go back to a moment that inequity was not reined in and there was no oversight in regards to how those students were being served.
Yeah, I think it's just such a misunderstood, and Stephanie touched on, what actually does the Department of Education do? And really, as a research arm, as a research and development arm, as a beacon for funding and equity, I think it really could be devastating for our students.
Absolutely.
So a signature accomplishment of the Biden administration and their Department of Education has been expanding mental health services and supports for students returning from COVID and quarantine. So Joli, I'll look to you. What would a loss of those supports and services mean to students and teachers as we continue to process the social, emotional, and academic impacts of the quarantine?
Yeah, I'll take that kind of question from the perspective of where I sit as a CEO of a nonprofit that provides social services. We see clients that come in that probably haven't been served very well, number one. We also see staff members that have been impacted. Yes. Number one, they might have graduated a college or high school throughout those COVID years, and we see them entering the workforce lacking just a little bit of something. And we know that as the position I'm sitting coming in as a CEO and when we're thinking about hiring and we're thinking about the youth that we serve, those mental health resources are critically important, especially the population that we prioritize and focus on, our LGBTQ plus community. Having those mental health resources for the most marginalized really can be kind of a defining moment of whether they are able to be successful and kind of live in their own independence, or whether, you know, they're still having to heavily rely on other avenues and supports.
I know I was just kind of immersing myself in research, and research out of the National Association for Education, or National Education Association, really highlights that I believe 1 in 4 teenagers express feelings of unhappiness, of anxiety, depression, and almost half of parents in the education system share concern for their children around mental health. And so we know as educators, I'm a former principal, district leader, being in the school, not only are students in need of, you know, intense mental health services, families are in need, but our educators are as well. And so I think that this is a top priority, or it should be a top priority for our current administration, and that we should continue to funnel resources to support our families.
I think during the pandemic, I was a principal on a school in the south side of Chicago, and that was a big challenge for us. You know, we had, of course, students that had several children in the home, and they were all trying to do school in the same space, and the parents were trying to support and didn't really know how to support, and we were trying to get the resources out to the family in terms of the laptops or what have you, and it just made it so much more difficult for the students. They didn't really know how to process what was happening. They were losing family members, and so coming back into the school system and having those social emotional learning supports for those students and for those families is definitely something that's needed. It's going to continue to be needed in our communities, in our Black and brown communities. They've already been desensitized to the violence that happens in their communities or with their families and their friends, and so just adding COVID to that is definitely another gavel on the head for them. And so I think having these supports, I had as a principal SEL services that came out and did group counseling for our students. They did one-on-one services for students. And so if those resources are taken away from schools through the Title I grants that you talked about, then what will our students have? Because a school's budget alone for services like that just don't cut it. We're buying materials, we're buying supplies, we're buying consumables, we're buying subscriptions to different programs for our students to have access to, because they were behind coming into the school year, but COVID has shown that students are at least 2 or more years behind their same age peers in other communities. And so I think having those supports financially and just resources, bodies, social workers, psychologists there for our children and families is something that will be a devastating blow to our communities if those things were to go away.
Yeah. Go ahead, please.
I would just add, we also know that during that time, schools are always a safe space, generally for our babies. But during that time of COVID, there was no safe space, right, to reach out to. And so many of our children were experiencing the worst of their home and daily lives without having the mental health support services, social workers, counselors, to really help them through that time.
And the supports, the direct mental health supports are at risk now, but there's also the kind of indirect mental health supports, the arts education and programming, out of school time activities that I just fear could be drawn back under a new presidential administration and reduction in funding for public education. And perhaps you could speak from a district level of how you're grappling with that and what scares you the most about that prospect?
So right now, luckily we're in a space in education where we do get school improvement grants for schools that are maybe underperforming, but that should not be the only reason why schools get these particular funds. There are so many schools in underserved communities who need that same kind of form support. We need a formula for education that is equitable, not necessarily equal for our schools. And we've been through a plethora of formulas, site-based budgeting and all of the things, but we still find that schools that are underperforming or have marginalized communities still get underfunded. And so right now, it's been a blessing that our schools have gotten, these school improvement grants where they're able to provide SEL spaces. And so that's what I'm coaching principals around, how to build these SEL spaces, not just for students, but for families to be able to come in and get the kinds of support that they need. Being able to offer things like before school drop off for parents who have to go to work early, and so they want to make sure their children get to school because kids aren't getting to school on time. And so it's things like that that happen in our communities very often that we don't always think about or don't happen in other communities. And so I think those are the things that the new administration needs to think about, and there needs to be bipartisan support when they're talking about what's going to happen in education.
Yeah, and when I think of public education in Chicago, one of the things that comes to mind is this idea of community schools, right?
Yes.
Public schools at the
Yes.
centers of community and community improvement. And one of the initiatives under a new Department of Education is going to be expanding school choice programs and potentially using vouchers to use public funds for private or religious education. And I'm interested in how we think that might affect, the financial stability of public education, but also the quality and equity in our public school system. Stefan, is that something you've been given some thought to?
I have, and I have very strong thoughts about it. We'll ease into it. I understand the case for school vouchers. I'll say that, but I do think in an already fragile system, I'm afraid that vouchers will do more harm than good. Specifically, when we look at the research and the data, we know that in communities that have used school vouchers, we see that they are used by those in a very high SES household, which means that we are going to continue to see kind of a disenfranchisement in communities that are underserved. And then this cycle of poverty kind of persists as opposed to being reversed. And so I think if we want to look at how to best use vouchers, we would need to do a lot of work on the front end to ensure that they are accessible and that there's equitable access and that the use of them is not diverting funds from an already under-resourced public school system.
To just pull on the thread that you said kind of at the end, I think there's a strategy for us to have a both-and approach. I think some of our marginalized students could be best served, them and their families, by having a choice, of if their current school is not serving them well or is not meeting their needs, what options do they have? I don't want our children to be left with no options. I don't want our families to be left without options. I also don't want funding to be diverted from already strapped, public education system and school districts. And so I think there is a strategy, and I know that there's smarter heads that can prevail in creating what that policy could be. But I really think that we should have those options on the table.
Yeah.
So, public education also is kind of ground zero for the woke conversation, for the culture wars, and the president has been very vocal about potentially restricting topics in schools, in education, about U.S. history, about our shared history. And I'm interested in this roundtable's thoughts on what a proposed restriction on teaching race, gender, identity, history, academic freedom. What does that mean for students? And I think from the youngest learners all the way up through college, this is something that, I know my daughter has a social justice curriculum in the second grade. It's not explicit, it's not based in structural racism, but it's making her aware, right? And it's something we're proud of as a family to talk to her about.
Sure.
So if we're restricting that, if we're putting federal restrictions on what can be taught in the classrooms, what impact does that have on pre-K all the way through college?
I think it has dire impacts. A lot of things that African American students learned. When we learn history, it's never Black history until it's February, right? And so there is no history. There is no American history without Black history. There is no history without the things that any culture or community has gone through. And I think that there has to be a well-rounded approach to be able to share those things. Education is where we learn things, right? The schools is where we learn things. And so I think we have to be careful to not be so right-winged or left-winged, that we're falling somewhere in the center so that we are not leaving out one group and we're totally appeasing the other group, and then vice versa. And so I think it's a fine line to walk when we're talking about education. And I think just the systems that we've employed already, just getting parental permission before we address certain content in the classroom, just to make sure they're aware of what is being taught, and if they're giving their child permission to be able to learn some of those things, because there are things that I don't want my child exposed to in the first or second grade, that now that she's in high school, I'm like, okay, that may be a more suitable age for her to be able to do that. And I know TV exposes children to a whole lot of things, but there are TV times that I've limited for my child. When she was younger, there was a cutoff time on her cell phone. There were times where she had to put her cell phone in my room at night so that she wasn't on the phone all types of the times of the night. And so I think there has to be balance, and that's really it.
Yeah, and Stefan, at a higher education level, how are you thinking about academic freedom in the face of these potential drawbacks or restrictions?
I think that by limiting or putting restrictions on content, we're really kind of disabling our ability to be critical thinkers, to contribute to a democratic society, to really tussle with ideas that may be different from our own. I'm reminded of a quote by Marcus Garvey that says that people without knowledge of their past is like a tree without roots. And we need the grounding to really help us understand where we are, but also where we want to go, what we don't want to repeat. And so I am for a classroom that explores kind of where we are, our American history. Because like you said, Black history is American history, but not just limited to Black history. Thinking about indigenous communities that are often invisible. I'm thinking about the history of LGBTQ rights and communities, Asian American communities that are often left from history as well. So I would like us to explore, where we've been and help us understand where we need to go as a country.
So Joli, in the first Trump administration, we saw, to me, a sort of shocking rollback or adjustments to the interpretation of Title IX. And I fear for what that could look like over the next 4 years, and I just would love your perspective on how rolling back civil rights protections for LGBTQ youth, protections for women in college campuses, what does this mean for vulnerable groups, for their safety, security, and education at all levels?
I think, for vulnerable groups, they're really at risk of not only the actions once you roll those back, but the rhetoric, right? The rhetoric is extremely damaging for individuals. We continue to see hate crimes across this country that are happening, not only for people along racial lines, but LGBTQ plus community members as well. To go back to a question you already asked as well, is like we have to learn this full history of who we are, because in my opinion, it helps us be more empathetic for others and their experiences. And a quote that's been used before, if we don't learn our history, then we're bound to repeat some of those negative aspects. I think if we don't fully learn all that the spectrum of LGBTQ plus community and what that really means, then we're at risk of rolling back those protections that are really there to make an equitable experience for all.
So we have just 1 short minute left. I'd love to go around very quickly and just hear, what are some steps that you think either yourself or parents and educators can take over these next 4 years? What's a word of encouragement you have for them?
Get involved in what's going on in the community around you, and get out there and vote. Because you have a voice and you have an opportunity to make your voice heard when you go out to the polls.
Stefan, Taquia, Joli, thank you sincerely for joining us and for your continued commitment and leadership. We look forward to each of you returning to the newsroom in the weeks and months to come. That's our time for this week. Andy returns next week for an all-new edition of Chicago Newsroom 2.0. Until then, be well and well informed.